Hello, my name is Alan Cano, and I'll be presenting the Filipino experience in America. We begin with illustrations given to us by Ken Bautista from Rappler.com. We'll start with the migration experience. Migration for the Philippines to the United States began in the late 19th century and has been driven in large part by long-standing political, military, and educational ties between the two countries, including a decades-long period of U.S. colonization. There have been several waves of immigration, but the pace escalated towards the end of the 20th century, as observed by Luis Gallardo and Gian Batalova. The timeline of migration started in 1763, where Filipinos settled in America, escaping Spanish galleon trade. In 1763 to 1906, they migrated to the West Coast, Hawaii, and then Alaska for better job opportunities and opportunities to educate themselves. During this time was the end of the Spanish-American War in 1898, where the Philippines were in the middle of it due to land disputes. And the first wave of Filipino immigrants arrived in the United States following the U.S. annexation of the Philippines in 1899, where they were seeking better opportunities, one of which is the Hawaiian sugar plantations, which offered opportunities for plantation laborers for Filipino Americans in 1906. And from 1900 to 1934 was U.S. colonization of the Philippines, which during this time allowed for migration from Philippines to U.S. to be more accessible. However, in 1934, the Tidings and McDuffie Act disallowed this by enacting a 50-person quota from the Philippines to the Americas. So, if a 51 person decided to immigrate from the Philippines towards America, they will be disallowed until the next year. So, anyone from Filipino Americas had to plan accordingly. This was amended in 1965 with the Immigration and Nationality Act, where they were less strict with immigration as well as allowing for more opportunities in the job market, specifically in healthcare, as they drew in nurses from the Philippines due to World War II drawing a need for more nurses to be employed. Then, in the mid 1970s, as political refugees left the Philippines, there was a growth in political and labor jobs being filled out by Filipinos, and thus a growth in more social diversity and political diversity. Then in 1990, an amendment to the Immigration and Naturalization Act came about, where the veterans from World War II were awarded citizenship as promised to them for fighting alongside the Allied powers against the Axis powers. Then in 2011, an Assembly Concurrent Resolution number 74 apologized to the Filipino Americans, specifically apologizing for the anti-Filipino movements, one of which was the 1930 Watsonville riots. One of the many places that Filipinos lived, and one notable place, is Stockton, California, a town named Little Manila.
These empty buildings used to be in the heart of Stockton.
I thought it'd be there forever.
Little remains of what used to be called Little Manila. Sisters Lillian and Violet remember Little Manila as children.
The Filipinos line the sweets.
After the U.S. took the Philippines as a colony in 1902, many came here searching for an opportunity, such as a job or a college education. Many took jobs on farms. Lillian and Violet's father came to Stockton from the Philippines sometime between 1916 to 1917. He started working in the field before becoming a labor contractor and then a small business owner in Little Manila. He owned a grocery store, was a partner at a gambling house, and the Quezon Hotel. It was torn down
were? At least 82.
Little Manila stretched for several blocks off El Dorado Street in downtown Stockton.
I lived on the fringe of Little Manila, but we were within walking distance of 2 blocks of Little Manila, and we did a lot of shopping of the Chinese delicatessens, and of course any Filipino food that we wanted.
By the 1920s, Stockton became the hub for Filipino Americans. Little Manila was a place Filipinos can be accepted. It was an unspoken law that if you were a person of color in the 1930s, you were not welcome north of Main Street. Stockton was one of the largest cities in the Delta area where there were other Filipinos and work could be found. There was room for them to stay, camps, hotels, lodges, people's homes.
They let people get their mail there. So when they came to back to town after being either in the camps, working in the grapes, working in the orchards, when they came back to Stockton, they could pick up their mail here.
Much of the Filipino American history has been documented by people like academic Don Mabalan, who was born and raised in Stockton. Terry Torres with the Filipino American National Historical Society has looked to her books and research for information. Torres says there were many firsts for the Stockton area because of the Filipino community. Churches, shops, and clubs were just few to name. Labor leaders like Larry Itliang fought for equal rights and conditions in the field. Based on Terry's research, there were 45,000 Filipinos in the U.S., according to 1930 census data, and 25,000 of them were working in crops in San Joaquin County. However, by the 1960s, redevelopment happened. Little Manila changed, and so did the entire neighborhood surrounding it. People were forced to move out.
They lost their jobs. They did not have enough money to rebuild their businesses because whatever money that was given by the government for destroying or demolishing their businesses wasn't enough to restore.
It's like coming back to a desert. Coming back where nothing, you can't remember anything because it's not there anymore. It's like someone took an eraser and cleaned this board.
Lillian passed away of cancer 2 months after this interview. We went through photos of her family and her time as an occupational therapist, as well as her life in Little Manila. A photo of her is up with her sister at the Filipino American National Historical Society Museum.
Mama, Papa, isn't that Mrs. Unsud?
According to the most recent census data with the American Community Survey for 2019, Filipino Americans make up the largest Asian American group in the city at an estimated 28,000 people in the city of Stockton. However, only a couple of buildings are left of Little Manila today. The sounds of people and music have been replaced by traffic noise, and its history preserved by people who know it. Its rich past has led to a powerful and tight-knit community today.
And that was one of the many places that Filipino Americans lived, where they thrived and their culture grew, as well as helped avoid some of the certain challenges and obstacles that they faced. This was one of the examples of assimilation. It was not easy, as Filipinos make up 17.7% of the Asian Americans who do not speak English very well. This, of course, led to certain translation troubles, and as we saw in the Hawaiian plantations, we read that the plantation owners prevented them from educating themselves past the 6th or 7th grade, where the plantation owners wanted to exert further control amongst the plantation laborers, specifically Filipinos. If they educated themselves further, they would get opportunities outside of the labor plantation labors. And as we see by Periokvi in ethnogeriatrics, the Filipino American community became more diverse during this period due to the immigration of highly educated professionals, mostly in the healthcare field, nurses, doctors, and medical technologists. The 1965 Immigration and Nationality Act, which liberalized immigration laws, made it possible to sponsor other family members, such as minor children, spouses, unmarried and married adult sons and daughters, and parents of adult U.S. citizens. As we read before, upward mobility is given to us by education. Thus, thanks to education among Filipino Americans, they were allowed this upward mobility and thus were allowed to further assimilate within American culture and the American society as a whole. This is the graph given to us by Sage Reader, proving Filipinos were 17% of the Asian Americans who spoke English less than very well. There were many obstacles that Filipinos Americans face, as all immigrants face in America, such as the growing Filipino population in Washington state, coupled with the mounting economic depression, caused the white labor force to perceive Filipino labor as threatening to their economic security. Consequently, white laborers resented Filipinos for undercutting wages. Economic tensions, along with the large Filipino population, sparked a nativist response similar to the earlier calls for Chinese and Japanese exclusion. As Fujita Roni argues, labor competition was the primary factor driving anti-Filipino sentiment in Washington state, increasingly motivating white workers to engage in violence directed against Filipino workers. This unfounded fear against Filipinos taking jobs has been seen before against other immigrants such as Hispanic Americans and other groups, as well as creating a division within Hawaiian plantations, which we see in Takaki. The manager's house was on top of the hill. Below it were the nice looking homes of the Portuguese and Japanese lunas, then the identical wooden frame houses of the Japanese camp, and finally the more run-down Filipino camp. The stratified system was laid out around its sewage system. This gave clear indication as to who was given more power in the hierarchical structure based on an arbitrary law. This was strengthened by the sewage system, essentially giving all of the excrement, all of the waste towards the lowest class, which in this case was the Filipino Americans in the Hawaiian plantations. This was done specifically by the plantation owners to create division between them to, as quoted in the book, divide and conquer. If they were able to make one superior to the other, then it would help them control the labor force. One of the obstacles was the prejudice, as they were seen as inferior to other Asian Americans, as we already saw by the Hawaiian plantations. However, a more recent example is being lumped in with other Asian Americans during the pandemic hate crimes. We saw, due to fear of COVID 19 and its spread to other people, that due to its source of origin from, as we right now have knowledge of, was started in Wuhan, China. Later on, other Asian Americans were also seen as carriers of the disease. Thus, hate crimes were committed against them out of fear. In terms of discrimination, they were faced with horrid farm practices as they were in the hot suns picking grapes, or placed in lower positions in the Hawaiian sugar plantations, as well as other fields of labor, such as service positions in, and becoming tradesmen. In terms of oppression, we will discover later on in further detail, but anti-miscegenation laws were created against them to prevent them from interracial marriage, specifically with white people, and limited migration, fulfilling the 50-person quota. No more than 50 people could immigrate from the Philippines to the US. We see plenty of examples of racism, not only from the Little Manila video, where Filipinos were excluded, specifically on signs in the north, but also we see in the 1930 Watsonville anti-Filipino riots, which we can see in the newspaper clipping to the right, where a Filipino was murdered as a victim of the rioters. We already stated before that 17.7% of Asian Americans were consisted of not speaking English, and that 17% was fulfilled by the Filipinos, which prevented them from certain opportunities, specifically in education, which prevented them from becoming more than just labor workers. Public policy specifically created to exclude this people group were the Tidings-McDuffie Act in 1934, which, as we stated before, was a 50-person quota. If a 51st person wanted to cross from the Philippines to the United States, they were disallowed until the next year. And to go into further detail with the anti-miscegenation laws proposed in 1935, we get this quote. According to the Northwest Enterprise, an organ of Seattle's African American community at the time, Todd introduced the bill following the application of a Filipino for a license to marry a white girl. We see this specific article in House Bill number 301, which prevented the interracial marriage of Filipinos with white Americans, where whether white Mongolian, as herein defined, shall not be granted a license to marry, as well as an application for marriage will be made by parties to marriage at least 3 days and not more than 30 days. There were certain conditions that prevented them to be married under this umbrella. However, this was prevented thanks to civil rights activists, both from African Americans and Filipino Americans. In compensation, there were public policies created to include and mobilize this people group. In 1965 was the Immigration Nationality Act, which loosened the 50-person quota thanks to World War II, where we in the US needed more nurses and more professionals in the healthcare industry. We got an influx of nurses from the Philippines as well as doctors and healthcare professionals. Then in 1990, an amendment was made to the Immigration and Naturalization Act as veterans from World War II were granted citizenship that they were promised back in World War II for fighting alongside the Allied powers against the Axis powers. This delay in citizenship was given nearly 25 years after the Immigration Nationality Act. The labor rules and contributions have already been illustrated to us before, with farmers in Hawaiian sugar plantations, as well as nurses, which was also noted by Bryce in her article describing her curiosity as to why many Filipinos became nurses, and she also came to the same conclusion as we read before, that nurses were created thanks to the 1965 Act of Immigration and Naturalization. However, Filipinos were also expanding into service-oriented jobs such as babysitting, care of the disabled, and care of the elderly in the community, where periodically observed that Filipinos, above all else, hold healthcare to their first priority. We also observed during the first stages of immigration that Filipinos were fishermen, adventurers, and in domestics, meaning that they cared for homes, they also explored, and they also sought to keep up with jobs in marine fields. To our right, we see one such example of farmers in Hawaiian sugar plantations. Achievements and impact Filipinos have made on American culture. We have Fenda Mundo, who created a children's hospital in her name, where she even sold her house twice to keep this hospital running and to add more wings and departments to this hospital. and her studies also led to the creation of the incubator, where we use it for bacterial and cell study. We also have Lucille Abad, who developed a plant vitamin to encourage plant growth using irradiated seaweed. And we will discuss further in detail where Pedro Flores invented the yo-yo. And a more recent example, and more notable example amongst those who are not more in tune with Filipino culture, is Jacob Batalon, who is a notable Filipino actor in titles such as Spider-Man No Way Home. We see examples of him speaking in Tagalog, which is a language of the Philippines, with other depictions of Filipinos within the movie. To go further in detail about the yo-yo, the first US patent for yo-yo-like toy was issued in 1866, but it was not until 1928 that a Filipino immigrant named Pedro Flores popularized the toy. While working as a porter in a Santa Monica, California hotel, he demonstrated various yo-yo tricks to the guests. Flores made a key innovation in the yo-yo. This key innovation was using a thread and tying a knot around the yo-yo, allowing him to do tricks that weren't possible with the previous patent with a rubber band, such as walking the dog. On the right, we have a photograph provided to us by Rick Kreutz. Thank you again for listening to my presentation on Filipino Americans. I hope after this presentation you come to understand the plights of Filipino Americans and come to appreciate the achievements and contributions they have made to American society and American culture. Thank you and have a blessed day at CBU, and I hope you live your purpose.